The police siren tore through the winter morning in Grand Forks, North Dakota, special task force vehicles skidding on the snowy surface, surrounding the rundown mobile home at the end of the street. The silver-haired man stood by the window, his trembling hand setting down his coffee cup as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face. 32 years earlier, a young female reporter vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty house, a cold cup of coffee, and a light that was never turned off. Now police believe they have found the last person to see her alive, and the truth behind that disappearance is about to be revealed after more than 3 decades of silence. Before diving deep into this chilling story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love real cold case mysteries, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Fall of 1980, Devil's Lake, North Dakota was shrouded in the chill from the lake, and a blanket of mist covering the narrow roads winding around the town. It was so quiet here that one could clearly hear the wind whistling through the maple trees and the waves lapping the shore at night. In the wooden house at the end of Lakeview Road, Clara Jensen, 27, a reporter for the Lake Region Times, was still sitting at her desk later than usual. On the table were half-typed manuscript pages, a few folded newspapers, a cooled cup of coffee, and a typewriter still stained with ink. The desk lamp cast light on her young but weary face, reflecting off the curtains gently swaying in the wind. Her husband, an Air Force officer, was stationed at the Minot base more than 200 miles away, and Clara was accustomed to nights with only the sound of the wall clock and rain pounding the tin roof. Neighbors said they saw the lights in the Jensen house stay on until late, then suddenly go out. No noise, no voices, just the neighbor's dog barking briefly before falling silent, as if something had frightened it. That night, the sky was thick with moisture and the smell of mud from the lake blowing in, carrying a heavy feeling, like a foreboding of something ominous. When dawn broke, Edna Carlson, the woman living 2 houses away, went out to get the paper and noticed the Jensen house door ajar. The living room light was still on, curtains swaying lightly, no one inside. She knocked a few times, called Clara's name loudly, only hearing the telephone ringing from deep inside the house. Everything inside was neat, dishes on the dining table, coat draped over the chair, shoes placed neatly by the door. No signs of struggle or break-in, just an eerie silence enveloping the entire room. By noon, after dozens of unanswered calls, Clara's mother in Minot began to fear the worst. She called the neighbors, then the local police with a faltering voice. Her daughter hadn't come home. No one knew where she was, and everything in the little house by the lake remained exactly as it had been the night before, as if time had stopped. The call was transferred to the Devil's Lake Police Dispatch late that morning, when mist still hung thick over the lake. The woman's voice on the line trembled, choking midway through sentences, saying that her daughter, Clara Jensen, had vanished. The door's open, the lights are still on, but there's no one in the house, she repeated, nearly breaking into sobs. Lieutenant Roy McKenna, on the morning shift, jotted the address quickly in his notebook, signaling 2 officers to bring the evidence kit. The patrol car sped off down the empty streets, tires slicing through the puddles from the previous night's rain. Upon arrival, Clara's small house emerged in the mist like a hazy golden block, the living room light still on, front door ajar, curtains swaying lightly in the wind. McKenna stepped onto the porch, calling her name several times, only hearing empty echoes in response. The house was unnervingly silent. He signaled his subordinates to check the surroundings, then headed straight into the living room. Everything was unnaturally neat, the coffee cup on the table stone cold, a single chair overturned, and the landline phone askew, its handset detached as if someone had been interrupted mid-call. No signs of break-in, no broken windows, no blood. On the wooden floor were faint, long scratches leading from the desk to the back door. McKenna noted every detail, sensing something off in the room's artificial order. The forensics team was dispatched immediately after. They used graphite powder to lift fingerprints around the phone, desk doorknobs, then collected a few stray hairs from the carpet. One technician discovered faint mud footprints of a man's shoe on the porch, along with a small scrap of fabric caught on a nail head in the fence. Everything was photographed, numbered, sealed in bags, and sent to the state lab. The exterior walls showed no pry marks, the back door locked from inside, only the front lock had fresh scratches. McKenna ordered a full inventory of belongings. Nothing stolen, cash, watch, jewelry all intact. Burglary was ruled out. He looked back at the coffee cup on the table, thinking of the previous night when it was still hot, then wondered what had made a woman vanish from a house with the lights still on. By late morning, police began taking statements around Lakeview. Edna Carlson said the Jensen house lights stayed on until nearly midnight, then went out completely. Afterward she heard the dog bark and a sound like a distant car engine starting. No one else saw Clara leave the house, and no neighbors heard loud noises. When police called Clara's mother in Mino, she confirmed her daughter had no plans to go anywhere, and usually called every morning. At the Lake Region Times office, colleagues said Clara was pursuing a sensitive investigation into supply contracts at Mino Air Force Base, having received multiple anonymous calls threatening her to stop digging deep. Her last manuscript was found in a drawer, unfinished, with 3 names underlined in the margin: R. Coyle, H. Demers, M. Kearns. McKenna took the documents back to the investigation room, marking this as the primary lead. Simultaneously, investigators checked Clara's contact log, compiling lists of friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. No one had a clear motive, but all described her as straightforward, sometimes recklessly bold. As the sun set over the lake, the first patrol cars returned to the station with sealed evidence bags. The preliminary report stated clearly, no signs of voluntary departure, no robbery motive, no staged scene. McKenna underlined a line heavily in his notebook, writing in bold capitals, "Missing under suspicious." 2 days after the disappearance was deemed suspicious, Lieutenant Roy McKenna brought Clara Jensen's initial file to a temporary office set up in the Devil's Lake police station. On the table was a stack of papers from the Lake Region Times, including unfinished manuscripts, a few 35mm film photos, and a list of 3 underlined names in her notebook. All pointed to one place, Mino Air Force Base. Clara had spent months investigating supply contracts at the base, where there were suspicions of missing technical equipment. McKenna realized this might be the only lead. He contacted the base commander, requesting meetings with anyone who had worked or communicated with Clara in the past 3 months. The military responded cautiously, sending only a brief memo stating no issues related to personnel or internal security. However, McKenna was permitted to interview a few on the list, including mechanical technician Randy Coyle, who appeared multiple times in Clara's notes. The interview took place in a small meeting room at the base. Coyle, in his early 30s, buzz-cut, wrinkled uniform, and evasive gaze. He said he met Clara 3 times to explain some technical procedures she didn't understand, insisting it was normal cooperation. McKenna asked about their last conversation. Coyle said that evening, he was at home watching TV and didn't go out, but a colleague stated seeing him leave the base around 9 p.m., driving a gray-green pickup truck. When confronted with the discrepancy, Coyle fell silent, then replied, "I just went to buy cigarettes." The recording officer looked at McKenna. Both knew the answer was untrue. With no direct evidence to charge, Coyle was immediately added to the suspect list. Forensics checked fingerprints lifted from Clara's house against Coyle's samples, negative match. His vehicle also didn't match the tire tracks near Stump Lake. These small details made McKenna suspect the military angle might be a dead end. Still, he collected all documents Clara had on the base, photocopied contracts, photos of the technical gate, even an expired visitor badge. In one blurry photo of engineers standing by the fuel depot, McKenna noticed in the background Ray Halverson, Clara's neighbor. At the time the photo was taken, Halverson still worked at Mino. This discovery forced McKenna to revisit all initial assumptions. He realized every clue centered on Mino Base, but no one had asked could someone in town be connected to the base. As Coyle was removed from primary suspect status, McKenna decided to expand the investigation beyond the military. He ordered a sweep of the Lakeview Avenue area, where Clara's house was located, checking resident lists, work histories, and prior records. In local files, Ray Halverson's name appeared again. 41 years old, living alone, former mechanical engineer, who served at Mino Base, until 1977, discharged due to back injury. He lived just 2 houses from Clara, often went out late at night, and barely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood. Police gathered more statements from other neighbors. A few weeks before Clara vanished, they saw Halverson in the Jensen front yard, seemingly helping her with phone wiring. This detail suspiciously matched the detached phone in the house. McKenna reviewed the scene report, unclear fingerprints on the phone, insufficient for comparison. He added Halverson's name, then had old employment records checked. Data from Mino Base showed Halverson handled fuel area maintenance, with access to industrial oil zones, the type found on Clara's clothing in preliminary tests. That afternoon, McKenna and an officer went to Halverson's house. He opened the door calmly, tall and thin, cold eyes. When asked about Clara, he said briefly, "I did meet her. She asked me to fix the phone, that's all." Inside, McKenna noticed old newspapers on the table. One was the Lake Region Times issue from the day Clara vanished, with her photo in a small column on page 2. In the corner, old phone repair tools and mechanical devices. Not enough for a search, McKenna just noted it, but unease rose. Back at the station, he placed the 2 files side by side, Coyle and Halverson, then looked at the final note on the report. The military investigation was fading into a dead end. No direct evidence, no clear motive, but something about the former engineer neighbor unsettled him. McKenna underlined Halverson, Ray heavily, then closed the file. He knew if this case didn't break soon, it would join the long list of hopeless disappearances in Devil's Lake. In the days following the investigation at Mino Base, gradually reaching a dead end, Lieutenant Roy McKenna returned to his desk with a heavy feeling. The notes from the Lake Region Times newsroom yielded no further clues, and the 3 soldiers Clara had interviewed all had clear alibis. Yet among the seized documents, McKenna remained troubled by a group photo of technicians in the fuel maintenance area. In the background, slightly blurred, was a familiar face, Ray Halverson, the neighbor living less than 100 meters from Clara's house. That name appeared in the Mino Base military records, just as he had briefly told the police. "I worked there, a long time ago." McKenna felt the thread connecting 2 seemingly unrelated ends beginning to tighten. One early morning, he and the forensic team returned to the Stump Lake shore area, where suspicious traces had been noted from the initial search. The mud had crusted over, but when they peeled back the thin layer of grass on the trail edge, they discovered a series of studded boot prints heading toward the water. Large size, thick sole, military style. The imprint left behind was the Corcoran jump boot type, standard issue for Air Force technical personnel in the late 1970s. McKenna didn't need to check to know Halverson had been issued that type of boot. A few meters away, another technician bent down beside tire tracks imprinted in the clay, measuring the X tread pattern, a rare type seen only in older Ford F-100 models. The Devil's Lake vehicle registry showed that in the entire area, only 2 people still used this type of truck, and one of them was Ray Halverson. That afternoon, McKenna knocked on his door. The old gray wooden house, rusty fence, tires stacked in the front yard. Halverson opened the door with indifference, wearing a faded flannel shirt, eyes ringed with dark circles. The living room smelled of machine oil mixed with cigarette smoke, the workbench piled with mechanical tools, and a few old newspapers. One of them was the Lake Region Times issue from the day Clara went missing, page 2 featuring her article. When McKenna asked, Halverson just shrugged. I keep old newspapers to line the table. What's strange about that? He asked further about the night of September 25th. He replied immediately. Voice even. I was home alone. Watched TV, then slept. Didn't leave the house. McKenna made no comment, just took notes, then suddenly asked, did you ever help Jensen fix her phone? Halverson looked up, eyes narrowing. Yeah. She asked me to reconnect the wire. Took 10 minutes. That happened the week before. That answer matched the scene perfectly. The phone disassembled, wires twisted halfway. The police requested to inspect the Ford parked in the front yard. Inside was unnaturally clean, the floor dry, not a speck of mud, while it had rained 2 days earlier. McKenna bent down, looking closely under the chassis, streaks of wash water still lingering on the frame, as if recently scrubbed. He said nothing, just told the technician to take samples of the remaining mud around the wheel axles. The next day's lab results showed it was clay-mixed soil, nearly matching the sample from the lake shore, but not enough to prove the truck had been there. Halverson was not arrested. There was no legal reason to allow it, but McKenna noted in the file, person of interest. He began covert surveillance. He left the house at the same time every morning, bought coffee at the gas station near the lake, then drove out of town for about 20 minutes, sometimes stopping on deserted trails, then returned before noon. He spoke little to anyone, no friends, no family, just lived with an old black dog named Duke. One evening, the surveillance team noted him carrying a cloth-wrapped object to the backyard, digging in the ground then covering it right after. When police returned the next day to check, the ground had been leveled, no traces left. In the following weeks, McKenna submitted reports to the state office with a temporary conclusion: no physical evidence, no witnesses, but Halverson remained the only subject with both opportunity and knowledge to commit the crime. The lab could not yet identify DNA on the evidence, and the fingerprints were too smudged to be useful. The press began to stop running stories. The volunteer searches also halted. The first winter cold snap arrived, freezing the lake surface, and with it, public interest froze over too. McKenna still often drove past the Jensen house every night, stopping at the curb for a moment, then leaving. The lights in the house were now completely off, only a property sealed by police sign taped diagonally on the door. On the last page of the November report, he wrote a short line, almost like a sigh: insufficient evidence for arrest. Continue surveillance. Case at risk of suspension. And from then on, everything began to slip out of reach. The Clara Jensen case, the young reporter from Devil's Lake, gradually sank along with the first layer of ice covering Stump Lake. A week after Clara Jensen's missing person case fell into a deadlock, a report from the volunteer search team shook the entire Devil's Lake Police Department. That morning, a man fishing on the south shore of Stump Lake called emergency, saying he had discovered something like a human shape, caught in the reeds near shallow water. Lieutenant Roy McKenna and the forensic team rushed to the scene. The lake surface that morning was misty, steam rising white, and the area where the body was found had been cordoned off with yellow police tape. The rescue personnel stood silently, heads bowed as McKenna approached. In the reeds, less than 2 meters from the water's edge, was the body of a woman wearing a light-colored shirt, dark hair matted with mud, face deformed from time in the water. No one needed long confirmation. The silver bracelet engraved CJ on the wrist was enough to say it was Clara Jensen. The body was transferred to the Ramsey County morgue the same day. McKenna stood behind the glass, watching pathologist Howard Kramer and the technical team conduct the autopsy. The wounds on Clara's body told a story far different from the voluntary departure hypothesis. She had asphyxiated occipital bone cracked from a strong impact. On the neck and shoulders were small circular marks like burns. The residue around them had a distinctive industrial oil smell. Kramer pointed to the bruising around the neck, saying softly, likely strangled before falling into the water. Time of death between the night of September 25th and early morning of the 26th. Forensics noted additional small scratches around the wrists, indicating the victim had been bound or rubbed against restraints. In samples taken from the clothing and hair, they found a type of lubricant originating from compounds used in mechanics, the same type commonly used in military technical workshops. When body fluid samples were sent to the analysis lab, technicians reported traces of unidentified male DNA. Along with that were a few thin white nylon fibers, stuck to the collar and sleeve edges, similar to fibers from cargo ties or binding ropes. McKenna requested comparison of these fibers with materials seized from Ray Halverson's garage, nylon rope used to secure mechanical equipment, but the lab lacked precise molecular comparison tools. He recorded all the information, mind reeling among dozens of possibilities, but all leading in the same vague direction: someone knowledgeable in mechanics, capable of controlling the scene, and who had close contact with the victim. That afternoon, McKenna returned to the lake shore area with the crime scene team. Under weak sunlight, the shore mud had dried, clearly showing boot prints and tire tracks extending to the dirt road connecting to the highway. The investigation team used rulers, sketched diagrams, photographed every detail. One officer picked up a beer can cap and a small piece of paper with oil stains, possibly dropped from the vehicle when the perpetrator returned to dispose. These traces were collected, but in McKenna's heart, he knew it would be hard to prove anything. Everything had been washed clean by time and lake water. He stood looking at the mirror-still water, small waves lapping the shore, cold and indifferent. Each question in his head spun in circles. Why here? Why this young reporter? When the autopsy report was complete, the official conclusion was sent to the county prosecutor's office. Cause of death: asphyxiation by strangulation. Head trauma suspected from a hard object. No signs of sexual assault. Time of death perfectly matched the night Clara disappeared. McKenna read the report, hand clenching until the paper crumpled. He remembered Halverson's words in the interrogation: "I was home all night." If true, he couldn't have been at the lake, but his Ford truck could. He requested another search warrant, but the county office refused due to lack of new legal basis. Halverson remained free, still living in the small house next to the road leading to Stump Lake, where Clara was found. News of the body discovery spread quickly throughout Devil's Lake. Local newspapers ran big headlines: "Missing reporter found after 1 week, suspected murder." Residents flocked to the lake area, bringing flowers and candles placed along the trail, forming a silent circle of light each evening. Clara's mother came from Minot, face haggard, just standing looking at the water, then silent. McKenna didn't dare approach, just bowed his head. He saw in her eyes something, not just pain, but an unspoken question: "Why haven't you caught him yet?" An emergency meeting was convened at the county headquarters. Forensics presented preliminary analysis results, the most prominent being the industrial oil compound found on the victim's body. This oil sample matched the type of lubricant used in some old military aircraft repair shops around Devil's Lake. However, the results could not pinpoint the exact source, and since weather and lake water had destroyed most evidence, everything stopped at speculation. "We have DNA, but no name," McKenna said. "We have evidence, but no one to claim it." The room fell silent. The case was officially reclassified from missing under suspicious circumstances to homicide investigation. But for McKenna, the new label only made it heavier. Now they were no longer searching for a living person, but pursuing a killer who had vanished into this too vast and too silent land. In the end-of-day report, he wrote a short line, bold and cold handwriting: "Case status, active homicide." No clear direction, and right below that, he added 3 words, circled: "Check Halverson again." In the months after Clara Jensen's body was found, the case became the focus of the entire state of North Dakota. The press ran thick coverage. Local television replayed images of the police car parked by Stump Lake, and residents gossiped about the shadow in that house, with lights on all night. But after the media explosion came long days of deadlock. All collected samples, hair, nylon fibers, industrial oil were sent to the state lab in Bismarck, where DNA technology was still primitive. After more than 2 months of waiting, the results came back, unable to identify from incomplete DNA sample. Scientists could only confirm the sample belonged to an adult male, no record in the system. McKenna read the thin report, folded it without a word. All efforts over the past half year ultimately boiled down to one short sentence: insufficient data. The morgue concluded the perpetrator had knowledge of mechanics, especially electricity and engines. The circular burns on Clara's shoulders suggested an electrical device had been used, possibly a welding part or repair tool. The industrial oil traces on her clothing matched the type used in jet engine maintenance shops. McKenna again saw the familiar name appear in his mind: Ray Halverson, who had worked in the Minot base fuel maintenance area, trained in electrical engineering, and lived less than 3 miles from the scene. In January 1981, McKenna submitted a second request to search Halverson's house. The file was returned. The county prosecutor said briefly, "No new evidence, insufficient legal basis." He didn't give up. Continued surveillance for many weeks. They noted Halverson still lived alone, days repairing things, evenings drinking beer, and watching TV. He didn't leave town, didn't contact anyone, and showed no unusual signs. But that very silence made McKenna shudder. One late February day, the investigation team found more information from Clara's old colleagues. An editor remembered that before disappearing, she had mentioned a stranger came to the newsroom, asking about the Minot investigation article. He spoke in a hoarse voice, claiming to be an electrician who had worked there. When asked more, the editor didn't remember the face because he wore a baseball cap, but described height and build nearly matching Halverson. McKenna hurried to re-ask Mrs. Edna Carlson, the Jensen house neighbor. She said in the week before Clara vanished, she saw a man in a gray coat standing at the door talking to her. Then they went inside together. When McKenna showed Halverson's photo, she glanced and nodded. "Looks a lot like him, but I'm not sure." Just 2 words, "not sure," caused everything to collapse. That testimony couldn't be used as evidence, only a vague impression from an elderly neighbor. Time continued to pass. Summer 1981. McKenna visited Halverson one more time, this time not in an interrogation room, but at his repair shop on the outskirts of Devil's Lake. Amid the smell of grease and mechanical sounds, he smirked faintly when McKenna appeared. "You guys still haven't found anyone?" he asked. McKenna replied, voice dry, "No, but I still believe you know more than you've said." Halverson didn't react, just wiped his hands on a rag, saying slowly, "Belief isn't evidence." That sentence followed McKenna for a long time after, every time he flipped through the file. Fall 1981, the lab sent additional results. The nylon fibers from the victim's clothing were industrial cargo tie rope, with a rare polymer structure, imported for a few factories and technical shops in northern North Dakota. One of them was where Halverson had worked post-war. McKenna tried to persuade the prosecutor's office one more time, but they held firm. Speculation cannot be evidence. He understood. The law at that time didn't allow arresting anyone based solely on technical coincidences. Throughout 1982, the case hung in limbo. The evidence was gradually sealed and moved to the state's cold storage archive. The press had moved on to other news, and Clara Jensen's name gradually disappeared from the front page. McKenna still kept the photo from the scene, the day the body was found, a black and white image, in which the lake wind blew her hair, as if it were still moving. Sometimes he looked at it for a long time, feeling there was something he'd missed, a small detail among thousands of pages. But every time he reviewed the file, everything returned to the same blind spot. No witnesses, no DNA, no evidence heavy enough. Late that winter, Halverson left Devil's Lake, sold the old wooden house to a young couple, and moved to Grand Forks, saying to find different work. McKenna couldn't stop him, and when Halverson's old Ford F-100 left town on a foggy morning, he just stood silently watching. A part of him understood that, along with that truck, the Clara Jensen case also left his grasp. 2 years later, the state office officially announced suspension of the investigation. In the summary report, the final line read, "No additional new leads. No suspects prosecuted. File transferred to archive status." McKenna read it, signed, then set down the pen, feeling as if he'd just closed the lid on a second coffin. Clara was dead, and now, the truth about her death was buried with her. As he stepped out of the room, cold wind blew through the hallway, carrying the smell of iron and mildew from the dust-covered files. He knew, no matter how much time passed, the questions around the Jensen case would remain in his head. No answers, only the silence of Stump Lake, where a woman had once vanished, and a killer who had never been called by his rightful name. In February 1982, while snow still blanketed Devil's Lake, a brief internal memo was sent from the state office. Jensen case, moved to cold case. No further investigative activity. The paper was only 4 lines long, but for Lieutenant Roy McKenna, it weighed heavier than any sentence. After 2 years of chasing every scrap of evidence, he had to sign the suspension order, sealing the entire file in an old pale gray box. Pasted on the lid was a dusty label, Case #8104, Jensen, Clara. As the seal was pressed down, the click echoed in the quiet room, like a latch locking away every remaining hope. Halverson left town just a week later. Neighbors said he moved out quietly, without saying goodbye to anyone, only taking a few boxes, an old dog, and a faded Ford F-100 truck. He was seen stopping at the gas station north of town, buying coffee, then driving straight toward Grand Forks. After that, no one mentioned him again. McKenna had kept a private portion of the file for himself, crime scene photos, witness statement notes, and a sketch map of Stump Lake, as a way to cling to the unfinished. But everything around him began to change. New cases appeared, budgets were cut, personnel transferred. That year McKenna was reassigned to another department. Before leaving the office, he opened the cold case cabinet one last time, touched the box labeled Clara Jensen, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Around the same time, part of the evidence in the case was lost when the old Ramsey County storage warehouse had a water leak. Many sealed bags were damaged, ink smeared, labels blurred, and unreadable. The technician's report noted that hair samples and nylon fibers were completely ruined by mold. Only a few key pieces of evidence remained: the fabric scrap, traces of industrial oil, and the body fluid sample, transferred to the new cold storage facility in Bismarck for indefinite preservation. No one knew that those tiny samples, after more than 30 years, would become the key to reopening the entire case. But at that moment, they were just cold plastic bags in a metal drawer, mixed among hundreds of other files of the forgotten. Life in Devil's Lake gradually returned to normal. Clara's wooden house was sold to a young family, the property sealed by police sign removed. They repainted the walls, planted a row of small maple trees in the front yard, and after a few years, no one remembered that it had once been a murder scene. The press stopped mentioning it. The archived files were pushed deep into storage, and in the townspeople's memory, the name Clara Jensen faded like the morning mist on the lake. For McKenna, the Jensen case never truly closed. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, in fitful sleep, in the sound of water lapping the shore whenever he drove past Stump Lake. He wrote letters to the state office multiple times, requesting retesting of the evidence as technology advanced, but never received a reply. Occasionally, he stopped in Grand Forks, where Halverson was said to be living, but couldn't find a specific address. Every year he wrote a line in his personal notebook: "Jensen, still no justice." That line repeated steadily through the 1980s, then grew sparse as his hair turned gray. The 1990s passed with the advent of DNA identification technology, but most old cases were overlooked, due to high costs. McKenna had retired, moving to Fargo to live with his daughter. In the small apartment, he kept a few career mementos, and among them was an old photo of Stump Lake at dawn, where Clara was found. Occasionally, he stared at it for a long time, wondering if the man, Ray Haverson, was still alive, or had died somewhere in these plains. No one knew, and no one asked any more. Time passed, those who had been involved in the investigation gradually moved away, lost contact, or died. The Ramsey County Records Room was relocated multiple times, old document boxes resealed, stacked in long rows in the state storage in Bismarck. Among hundreds of dusty labels, the small box numbered 80-104 lay untouched, unopened for more than 3 decades. On the first page of the file, Roy McKenna's handwriting was still legible, though faded. Person of interest Ray Haverson to be rechecked if new technology allows. Then time swept everything away. Those who once knew Clara were now elderly. Memories of her were just vague stories in the town coffee shop, told between autumn gusts. Devil's Lake grew, new asphalt roads replaced the old dirt ones, and the house where she lived was now renovated into a small fishing cabin for tourists. No one thought about the case that had gone dormant since 1982, but in a cold storage drawer deep in the basement of the Bismarck archive, amid the hum of compressors, those samples labeled Jensen, Clara, DNA pending analysis, still remained. And for more than 30 years, they waited in silence, waiting until technology and fate together reopened the door that had been sealed since that winter. In October 2011, the state cold storage in Bismarck, where old files had lain in darkness for decades, was reopened for the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation's NDBCI Cold Case Re-Examination Program. Among hundreds of stacked boxes, a faded gray one with a barely legible label caught the attention of Detective Marin Holt, an investigator newly assigned to the task force. The handwritten line was almost gone but still readable. Case hash 8104, Jensen, Clara. Next to it, in bolder pen, scrawled but clear, to be rechecked if new technology allows. Signed by Lieutenant Roy McKenna, who had died in 2006. Holt opened her notebook, marking this case as a priority. She was just over 30, with a habit of reviewing every old detail, believing no case was truly dead if physical evidence remained. Opening the sealed box, the smell of cold metal and old paper filled the air. Inside were the intact evidence bags, a small fabric scrap, dried industrial oil sample, thin nylon fiber, and most importantly, a vial containing the body fluid sample preserved in solution, untouched, since 1982. The seal still bore the mark of the Ramsey County Forensics Lab. For Holt it was rare. Most evidence from that era was damaged or lost. She took the file back to the cold case unit office in Bismarck. That evening, under fluorescent lights, Holt went through each typed report, rereading McKenna's statements, crime scene diagrams, footprint photos, all things that seemed meaningless with modern investigative technology. But at the end of the file, she stopped at the detail, unidentified male DNA sample, insufficient for analysis. Next to it was McKenna's note, check again when DNA methods improve. It was like a message across time. Holt picked up the phone, contacting the state lab. I want to retest the Jensen evidence. Samples stored in 1980. Goal, create a full DNA profile. 2 weeks later, the vials were transferred from Bismarck cold storage to the North Dakota State Crime Lab. Technicians extracted the sample using modern protocols, STR, short tandem repeat technique, that could identify DNA sequences even from a few intact cells. After nearly a month of waiting, Holt received an email from the lab. Profile successful, gender, male, sample qualifies for CODIS upload. She read those words multiple times, her heart pounding as if at the first turning point of a new journey. The DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS Combined DNA Index System, the national database storing millions of criminal DNA samples across the U.S. Holt and the technician sat in front of the screen, watching the status bar progress through checks. Finally the result appeared. No match found, no match with any record. The room fell silent. Holt sighed, but wasn't disappointed. Obtaining a complete profile, after more than 3 decades, was already a major step. She spent the following weeks reviewing the entire case context. Clara Jensen, young reporter missing and murdered in 1980. The only suspect at the time, Ray Halverson, 41, former Air Force engineer, living near the victim, noted as a person of interest. Holt tried to find his updated address records, but only found a short line in the civil database. Raymond Halverson, Grand Forks, deceased, 1997. No specific death certificate, no relatives, no immigration records. It seemed he had vanished from the U.S. map just as Clara had vanished from Devil's Lake. Holt didn't stop. She requested cross-analysis of the perpetrator's DNA with unsolved cases in northern North Dakota and Minnesota from 1975, 1985, looking for partial matches. After multiple data runs, only one case showed 60% similarity, an unsuccessful assault in Minnow, in 1979, victim a female Air Force technician. That case was also never solved. Holt immediately requested comparison samples, but the results weren't sufficient to confirm the same person. Still, it made her believe the perpetrator had ties to Minnow Base, the lead McKenna had pursued to the end. By year's end, Holt filed a report to the NDBCI director. She proposed placing the Jensen case on the high-priority forensic re-examination list, aiming to combine the new DNA profile with genetic genealogy technology being tested in other states. In the conclusion, Holt wrote, "After more than 30 years, the Jensen case still has a voice. The DNA sample is intact. The file is complete, and the truth, though old, has never died." As night fell, Holt left the office, crossing the snow-covered parking lot, her mind still lingering on the image of the gray box with the handwriting of the man now gone. In the Bismarck cold storage, that box had been reopened, after 30 years of silence, beginning the journey to find the answers Roy McKenna had promised himself but never completed. Early in 2012, after nearly a year pursuing the Jensen case, Detective Maren Holt couldn't shake the feeling that the DNA profile hadn't told its full story. The profile was created, but CODIS still returned no match. For most investigators, that was the end, but for Holt, it was just a detour. She knew of a new method being tested in neighboring states, forensic genealogy, tracing indirect relatives of the perpetrator through public genealogy data. This method had solved seemingly hopeless cases in California and Oregon. If successful in North Dakota, it would be the first time. In March, Holt contacted Dr. Emily Tran, a Vietnamese-American forensic genetics expert at the private research lab GenQuest in Minneapolis. Emily was a pioneer in using public genetic data from genealogy websites to narrow down suspects. After reviewing the Jensen file, she agreed to join. "If the DNA sample is still clean enough," Emily said, "I can build his family tree, but it will take time and a bit of luck." The unidentified male DNA was re-extracted, creating a complete genetic sequence uploaded to GEDmatch, a genetic database, allowing searches for distant relatives based on DNA similarity. One night in early May, Holt received an email from Emily with a short subject, "We have a hit." The first line read, "Match 3% with a male user, surname Halverson, Michigan." Holt read that number over and over. 3% sounded small, but in genetic genealogy, it could mean a distant relative like a great-uncle, cousin, or third cousin. In other words, the perpetrator likely shared blood with someone named Halverson living in Michigan. Holt barely slept for the next 3 nights. She and Emily began building a reverse family tree from this user. By tracing public records, birth certificates, and Halverson family lines that had migrated from Minnesota to North Dakota in the previous century, they gradually created a massive family tree spanning 3 generations. Among more than 20 branches, only one fit both geographically and by age. The line of Raymond Halverson, born 1939, who served as a mechanical technician at Minnow Base, then lived in Devil's Lake in the late 1970s, exactly when Clara Jensen was murdered. Holt reopened the old file. The name Ray Halverson appeared in Lieutenant Roy McKenna's report, circled and underlined. A small note below: person of interest, no warrant issued. Everything matched perfectly: age, occupation, home location, and especially his disappearance from Devil's Lake right after the case was suspended. Holt closed her eyes, a chill running down her spine. More than 30 years ago, McKenna had been on the right track, only lacking the technology to prove it. But one thing still puzzled her. Old civil records listed Halverson deceased 1997. She needed verification. Holt sent requests for death certificates through Michigan and North Dakota archives, but neither state had a matching record. Only an entry in the federal SSA, Social Security Administration database, showed Halverson received pension payments until 2008, meaning he was alive at least until then. On June 12, Holt officially submitted to the state prosecutor's office a proposal to reopen the Jensen case, based on new findings from DNA genealogy analysis. The prosecutor required additional evidence for a surveillance warrant. Holt decided to find the answers herself. She followed clues from Social Security data, locating a new address in Grand Forks, a small mobile home on the edge of Route 6, under the name Raymond C. Halverson, 73 years old. 3 days later, Holt drove to Grand Forks. The quiet road, old mobile homes lined up closely, wind carrying the smell of gasoline and rust. Halverson's home was at the far corner, faded walls, windows covered with dark curtains. In the front yard, still the 1976 Ford F-100 truck, repainted dark gray. As Holt walked slowly past, her heart pounded. It felt like time was repeating the image from McKenna's report, more than 30 years earlier. Back at the office, she filed for a secret surveillance warrant. In the report to the BCI director, Holt wrote, "Basis to identify suspect living in Grand Forks. Based on DNA genealogy results and employment records, probability of involvement exceeds 95%. Recommend surveillance and anonymous DNA collection for comparison." The warrant was signed the next morning. A 3-person surveillance team was sent to Grand Forks, setting up positions 2 blocks from Halverson's home. He lived alone, with old habits, up at 7, taking trash to the truck, then driving about 10 miles, stopping at the only gas station on the highway. Once he bought coffee and tossed the paper cup in the trash outside the store. Holt signaled the team to retrieve it. The sample was carefully sealed, sent directly to the state lab. 3 weeks later, the results came back. DNA from the coffee cup matched completely with the sample from victim Clara Jensen's clothing. Statistical error rate 1 in 1.2 billion. Holt read the report with trembling hands. More than 30 years later, the mystery around Stump Lake finally had an answer. The perpetrator of the 1980 murder was not a stranger, not some ghost from the past, but the very neighbor who had stood at Jensen's door, smiling and saying, "I was just helping her reconnect the phone line." As Holt looked out the window, the first snow of the season began falling on the streets of Grand Forks. She knew this 3-decade journey was nearing its end, but a question still rose in her heart. When justice arrives this late, does it still have the power to make the guilty bow their head? Immediately after the DNA results were confirmed, Detective Maren Holt sat quietly in front of the screen, staring at the bold text, "Match 100%. Subject, Raymond C. Halverson." There was no doubt anymore. 32 years, thousands of pages of files, every guess Roy McKenna had made back then was finally proven. But Holt knew that having a match was just the first step. To catch Halverson, she needed legal evidence, and that meant tracking his every move to build the case before requesting an emergency arrest warrant. The surveillance team was kept the same as during the sample collection phase. They set up temporary headquarters at an old motel less than a mile from Halverson's mobile home park. He lived alone, his routine repeating like an old clock. 6:30 in the morning, he left the house, opened the garage door, started the faded silver Ford F-100 still bearing old North Dakota plates. 7 o'clock, he arrived at the Red River Stop gas station, bought black coffee and a copy of the Grand Forks Herald, then sat on the wooden bench out front smoking. After that, he drove around the suburbs, sometimes stopping at a junkyard or small auto repair shop, talking to a few acquaintances before heading home before noon. In the afternoon, he often sat on the porch reading the paper, quiet as if nothing in this world was worth caring about anymore. To Holt, it was that very calm that chilled her, the silent demeanor of a man who had once strangled a young woman and buried the crime for half a lifetime. The first 3 days of surveillance, he showed no unusual behavior. The team logged every movement, photographed license plates, archived footage from public cameras around the area. On the 4th day, Holt decided to collect another DNA sample for reconfirmation, to avoid any chance of error in court. That morning, Halverson went to the gas station as usual, bought coffee, and chatted briefly with the cashier. As he left, an agent approached, gloved, and took the still warm paper cup from the trash. The sample was placed in a sealed bag, labeled with the time 7:48 a.m., and sent immediately to the Fargo lab. 3 days later, the results came back, match confirmed, identical DNA profile, random match probability, 1 in 1.2 billion. Holt placed the report next to McKenna's old file, 2 generations of investigators, 2 eras of technology, finally meeting in the same conclusion. "We got him," she said softly, her voice almost emotionless. That evening, Holt submitted the report to the state prosecutor and requested an emergency arrest warrant. In the 11-page petition, she outlined the entire process, from discovering the still-sealed evidence, modern DNA analysis, to genetic genealogy results, and direct surveillance. Everything followed legal procedure, every sample certified by the North Dakota State Crime Lab. When the prosecutor read the final part, the absolute DNA match with the sample taken from victim Clara Jensen's clothing, he just nodded. "We'll get the warrant first thing tomorrow morning." That night, Holt didn't go home. She sat in her car, parked outside Halverson's mobile home park, watching the flickering yellow light in the window. He was still awake, sitting at the table, drinking beer and reading the paper. The wall behind him was covered in old photos and maps of the Devil's Lake area, exactly as McKenna had described in his 1980 file. She wondered how he had lived with that guilt for 30 years, or if he ever felt guilty at all. The next morning, 7:15 a.m., the NDBCI Special Operations Team coordinated with Grand Forks Police to make the arrest. The sky was lead gray, thick fog covering the damp, cold road. As the Ford F-100 started and pulled out of the driveway, 2 police cars blocked the front at the end of the street, another locked the rear. He startled, braked hard, then sat motionless behind the wheel. Holt stepped out, wearing a leather jacket, the arrest warrant held firmly in her hand. "Raymond C. Halverson," she announced loudly through the bullhorn, "you are under arrest on suspicion of involvement in the murder of Clara Jensen, Devil's Lake, 1980. He looked up, his eyes blank, as if he didn't understand what she was saying. As police escorted him from the vehicle, Holt stood close, clearly smelling the industrial oil still clinging to his jacket sleeves. The scent forensics had noted on Clara's body. He glanced at her, gave a faint smile. "You're 30 years too late, detective." Those words thickened the air, every sound seeming to recede. In his garage, the search team discovered a wooden box full of old papers, photos of areas around Stump Lake, a few clipped articles about the Jensen case, a lighter engraved with RH, and most importantly, a coil of white nylon rope, the same type as the fiber found on the victim's clothing. Everything was sealed on site. As Halverson was transported to the Fargo Detention Center, Holt looked through the car window and saw him sitting still, hands cuffed but eyes strangely calm. After 32 years, finally, the man once called, the ghost by Devil's Lake had a real name in the file. Raymond C. Halverson, suspect in the murder of Clara Jensen, 1980. That evening, at the BCI office, Holt wrote the final report for the surveillance phase. She ended with a short line, echoing the way McKenna had noted it before. Operation successful. DNA confirmation achieved. Suspect in custody. Case #8104, active again after 32 years. Outside the window, snow fell lightly, covering the Grand Forks street in a hazy white. In the quiet room, Holt sat motionless for a long time, realizing that this silence was different from all the others. No longer the silence of mystery, but the silence of justice slowly returning, after more than 3 decades of waiting. The morning of December 18, 2012, snow fell heavily over Grand Forks, blanketing the mobile homes on the edge of Highway 6. The North Dakota BCI Special Operations Team, coordinating with local police, had been ready since before dawn. Every plan was meticulously prepared, the emergency arrest warrant signed at 5:30 a.m., the search warrant approved at the same time. Detective Maren Holt, who had spent nearly 2 years pursuing the Jensen case, sat in the command vehicle, holding a black and white photo of Clara Jensen, taken in 1980. She glanced at it briefly, then put it back in her pocket, took a deep breath, and signaled to proceed. While the sun still hadn't broken through the gray fog, 3 specialized vehicles sped to Raymond Halverson's mobile home. The door was kicked in, the special operations team flooded inside. Inside, Halverson was sitting at the kitchen table, still in his sleepwear, with a steaming cup of coffee, and the Grand Forks Herald on the table. He looked up, his eyes showing no surprise, just saying softly, "Finally here." 2 officers approached, read him his Miranda rights. Halverson didn't resist, didn't ask why, just held out his hands, voice even, "Cuff me, detective. I know you've been watching." While he was being restrained, the search team began combing the house. The small room was tidy, neat to the point of being cold. On the walls were dozens of old newspapers, mostly yellowed, clipped articles about Clara Jensen's disappearance, and the discovery of her body in 1980. One was laminated, the bold headline, "Young reporter found dead at Stump Lake." Police baffled. In the corner of the table was a scratched steel Zippo lighter, engraved with RH and the year 1975, still with black soot inside. In the drawer, Holt discovered an old cream-colored landline phone, the type discontinued decades ago, with the handset detached, coiled cord old, identical to the scene at the Jensen house. Everything was photographed, sealed, numbered, and transferred to the evidence vehicle. Holt stepped closer to him. Halverson sat in the chair, hands cuffed, face inexplicably calm. "I saw you at the gas station," he said, voice low. "I figured you took the cup. I even left it for you." Holt looked straight at him. "You know why we're here?" He shrugged. "I know, but it took you 32 years to figure out the obvious. That's quite a while." As he was led outside, neighbors gathered at the end of the row, watching in silence. A middle-aged man muttered, "I've lived next to him for 10 years, never heard him raise his voice." They couldn't believe the old reclusive man was once the figure in a notorious murder. Halverson was put in the car, head bowed low, eyes looking out the window where snow swirled thickly. At the Fargo Investigation Center, the first interrogation began that afternoon. The small interview room, white light shining down on the metal table. Holt sat across from him, thick file in front of her. Halverson didn't want a lawyer, said he wanted to talk himself. For the first hour, he just sipped water, observed Holt, then asked, "Did you ever meet Roy McKenna?" Holt replied softly, "He's gone." Halverson nodded, a strange sadness flashing in his eyes. He got closer than anyone else, but back then, his science wasn't enough. When Holt asked about the night of September 25, 1980, Halverson didn't deny it. "I did go to her house. She called me over to check the phone line. It was getting interference. I helped her detach the cord, but then we argued. She said things she shouldn't have. I just meant to scare her, but things got out of control." He paused, looking at his hands. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her to shut up." Holt pressed, "About the burn marks, the industrial oil on Clara, how do you explain that?" Halverson gave a faint smile. I've worked with machines my whole life. That smell never leaves you. The answer was cold enough to weigh down the room. Throughout the interrogation, he showed no remorse. Only once, when Holt asked why he kept the old phone, Halverson replied, "Because it was the last thing I touched before everything ended. You wouldn't understand." That statement made Holt shiver slightly, not just because of his calm, but because the detail about the phone had never been released to the press. Only someone at the scene would know the handset was detached. Every word, every sentence was recorded, transcribed. Forensics confirmed the items seized from the house matched the 1980 report descriptions exactly. Phone cord, of the same type, lighter, of the same material, newspapers from the same dates. In his mechanic's toolbox, there were still traces of oil with a chemical structure matching the sample found on Clara Jensen's clothing. When the interrogation ended, Halverson requested a cigarette. Holt watched him take long drags, the Zippo flame flickering in his eyes. "Now you have everything," he said. "But don't think you understand why it happened." Then he looked straight at her, the faint smile dissolving into the smoke. As Halverson was transferred to the holding cell, Holt stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, sighed. She felt a mixed emotion clearly, relief, but also heaviness. For over 3 decades, the Jensen case was an unhealed wound for all of Devil's Lake. Now justice finally had a real face, an old wrinkled face, but still as cold as the first night he stepped into the house with the lights still on. The second interrogation was conducted 3 days after Raymond Halverson was arrested. The Fargo Investigation Center's interview room was carefully prepared, video recording, audio system, and the forensic team monitoring from the adjacent room. Detective Marin Holt sat across from him, this time with a state prosecutor representative present. The white light shone straight down on the metal table, reflecting Halverson's thin, gaunt but still cold face. He didn't request a lawyer, just said he wanted to talk himself to get it over with quickly. "Do you understand why you're here?" Holt began, voice calm. Halverson nodded slightly, eyes not leaving the camera lens in front of him. "Because of that girl," he replied. "But it was an accident, detective. I didn't mean to kill her." He told the story his way, a version carefully shaped over the years. According to him, that night Clara asked him over to fix the phone line. She was stressed, irritated about some article at the base. Then we argued. I lost control, just pushed her down. Her head hit the table. After that, I panicked. I thought she was just unconscious. He paused, voice slow as if telling an old story to himself. I didn't know what to do. I carried her to the car, meant to take her to the hospital, but halfway she stopped breathing. I just wanted to hide the accident. Holt looked straight at him. Accident, but you tied her hands, unplugged the phone, and drove the body to Stump Lake in the middle of the night. That's an accident. Halverson was silent. He took a long breath, then shrugged. I was scared. What would you do if you had a body, and no one would believe you were innocent? From the adjacent room, the forensic team watched every small expression. The prosecutor took notes continuously, marking inconsistencies, departure time, vehicle position, tying details. None matched the physical evidence. That afternoon, Holt presented the results of the scene reconstruction, using the NDBCI tech team's new 3D technology. The entire Jensen house was rebuilt, based on 1980 scene photos and sketches, recreating the perpetrator's path, impact position, and blood trajectory. When the simulation was projected on the large screen in the interview room, Halverson stared, his eyes wavering for the first time. The simulation showed Clara attacked from behind, strangled and slammed hard into the table edge, a position that could never happen from an accidental fall. On the model, the phone line was detached before the altercation, proving he intentionally cut communication before acting. Holt pointed to the screen, said softly, "You call this an accident?" Halverson closed his eyes, hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand. I just wanted her quiet," he muttered, voice almost losing control. She threatened to write about me, about what I'd done at the base. I couldn't let that happen. That statement cut through the air like a knife. Holt immediately looked up, eyes sharp. What you did at the base? He didn't answer, just gave a faint smile. Doesn't matter anymore. As the investigators presented new evidence, Halverson began losing his composure. The crime lab had completed comparisons of the oil and nylon fiber samples from the victim's clothing, with items in his house. Results: the oil's hydrocarbon composition and metal impurities matched 100% with the diesel oil spilled on the leather seat of the Ford F-100. The nylon fiber also matched exactly the type of cargo tie-down rope found in the garage, produced exclusively for the engineering plant where Halverson once worked. When Holt placed the report in front of him, Halverson read each line, face wrinkling. "You're good," he said, voice bitter. 30 years ago, no one could do this." Holt replied softly. 30 years ago, justice still owed Clara Jensen an explanation. They continued questioning him about the night he took the body to the lake. He said he didn't remember clearly, just remembered it was dark, and the water was very cold. But the GPS mapped route, based on tire tracks and vehicle distance, proved he drove straight to the Stump Lake area, where tire imprints in the clay matched his vehicle's size exactly. When asked why he brought nylon rope and oil, he said to tie cargo, but couldn't explain why the nylon appeared on the victim. The prosecutor stood, reread the inconsistencies in his statement. "You say Clara died from a fall, but why was she strangled until asphyxiated? You say you were scared, but why wipe the scene clean, wash the car, and keep her phone like a memento?" Halverson was silent for a long time. Finally, he said slowly, "Because I wanted to remember so I wouldn't make the mistake again. But turns out memories always catch up. Everything was filmed, audio clear, every breath." Forensics confirmed the details he described about the house, table position, and lamp corner matched exactly the original 1980 photos. Information never publicly released. That was golden evidence, confirming he was the only person at the scene when Clara was killed. The interrogation ended as sunset fell over Fargo. Halverson was taken back to his cell, face impassive, eyes deep as if emotionless. Holt sat alone, looking at the 3D screen of the Jensen room, where a young woman once stood under the soft yellow table lamp, then lost everything in just a few minutes. She tapped her pen on the table, wrote the final line in the report. Subject admitted partial involvement, attempted to redefine murder as accident. Forensic reconstruction disproves his claim. All statements recorded. Inconsistencies will be submitted as direct evidence for indictment. Outside the glass, snow fell thickly covering the investigation center's parking lot. In the dim light, Holt felt the cold wind cut through her skin, but deep inside was a different feeling, both heavy and relieved. 32 years finally, the truth had a clear shape. It wasn't in the confession, but in the very inconsistencies the killer couldn't deny. After the final interrogation, Holt knew she was close to the finish line, but close wasn't enough. Despite Halverson's clearly contradictory statements and the physical evidence from the truck, nylon rope, and industrial oil all matching up, she still needed one final piece, something that could nail him in court. That night, after everyone in the office had gone home, Holt returned alone to the evidence storage room. The room was freezing, fluorescent lights casting down on neat rows of metal shelves. Each shelf held dozens of labeled evidence bags, so old the handwritten notes had faded. In the bottom compartment, she found the original sealed box from the Jensen case, the one Roy McKenna himself had signed 4 decades earlier. Holt broke the seal, carefully removing each bag, fabric samples, nylon rope, crime scene photos, then a small clear bag labeled in blue ink, "Ring," recovered from victim's left hand. The pale gold wedding ring, simple engraved inside with the initials CJ, still glinted under a thin layer of dust. Holt reread the old report. No signs of forced removal, not sent for testing. She frowned slightly. Why had the jewelry she wore every day, the only thing left intact, never been examined. The next morning, Holt took the ring to the forensics lab. The technician specializing in metal samples said that even after decades, the inner surface might still hold latent fingerprints, thanks to the soft metal not fully oxidizing. The laser fluorescence fingerprint scan took nearly 3 hours. As the blue light swept across the surface, Holt and the team held their breath. Then on the screen, thin swirling ridges appeared, clearer than anyone expected, a complete fingerprint. The technician compared it to the database sample obtained from Halverson at arrest. The result came back in minutes, match confirmed, right index finger, Raymond C. Halverson. Holt stood still, her heart pounding. The ring, the item she wore daily, a symbol of her private life, had now become the final evidence closing the entire chain of crimes. That fingerprint was on the inner surface, a place it could only appear if he had directly touched it while removing it from the victim's finger. When the report was sent up, the state prosecutor read it and said simply, "This is the coffin nail." The investigative agency immediately added the result to the indictment file. In the meeting, Holt presented the full chain of evidence in perfect order: DNA match on the victim's shirt, industrial oil and nylon fibers matching Halverson's truck, contradictory statements, and finally, the fingerprint inside the wedding ring. Everything formed an airtight logical chain, with no gaps for the defense. The next day, Holt personally returned the ring to the evidence display room. She placed it in a separate glass case, with a small note underneath, recovered from cold case hash 8104. Key evidence identified after 32 years. As light passed through the glass, the ring reflected a faint golden band, silent but sharp as justice freshly cleansed. That evening, Holt sat alone in her office, opening the black and white photo of Clara Jensen, the young woman smiling, wearing that very ring on her left hand. Holt whispered as if sending a message, "We found it, Clara, the final piece." And as she left the office, snow began to fall again. Outside, the flakes silently covered the Fargo streets, melting under the yellow lights, just like the dust of time wiped clean from a case thought buried for over 30 years. When the fingerprint analysis report on Clara's wedding ring arrived, the Jensen case file was complete with no room left for doubt. The North Dakota State Prosecutor's Office entered the final phase, merging all DNA, physical, forensic, and testimonial evidence into a tight logical chain, a complete picture of a crime spanning over 3 decades. In the Ramsey County Courthouse conference room, Chief Prosecutor Paul Rennick led the synthesis meeting with BCI investigators. On the board was a timeline from 1980 to 2012, data points connected by red lines, the oil-stained shirt, nylon rope, fingerprint inside the wedding ring, DNA match, and finally, the contradictory statements. "We don't just have one piece of evidence," Rennick said, tapping the board. "We have an entire link chain the defendant can't escape." The forensics department presented the summary report. DNA from the victim's shirt matched perfectly with the sample from Halverson's coffee cup. Diesel oil and nylon fiber samples had identical chemical structures and origins to materials from his truck. The fingerprint found inside the wedding ring, in a position impossible to touch, without directly removing it from the victim's finger. The lab's final conclusion: biological, mechanical, and circumstantial evidence all align, ruling out any possibility other than Raymond C. Halverson as the sole perpetrator. When the file was transferred to Ramsey County Preliminary Court, Halverson's defense attorney, a well-known figure in Fargo, immediately filed a motion to suppress. They argued that the forensic genealogy data used by Holt and expert Emily Tran violated citizen privacy, as the DNA source came from a civilian genetic database. The defense's argument: "My client never voluntarily provided a DNA sample for comparison. Using expanded genealogy data is illegal and lacks legal basis." The court immediately held a special hearing on the evidence's legality. The prosecution countered by presenting the full technical process. Genealogy data was used only to identify potential relatives, without accessing personal information. All results were verified with DNA samples collected directly from Halverson under legal supervision, and court approval. Notably, the physical evidence chain, fingerprint, industrial oil, nylon fibers, was independent of genetic data, but led to the same single conclusion. The federal judge reviewed the file for 2 days. In the ruling read on the afternoon of the third day, he declared, "The court finds that the collection, analysis, and comparison of DNA in the Jensen case were conducted in accordance with current legal standards, without violating citizen privacy. The genetic genealogy evidence is admitted." A quiet round of applause rose from the prosecution's side, while Holt, sitting in the back, simply clenched her fists. 32 years after Clara Jensen disappeared, her file had finally been brought into the light of the courtroom. On January 22, 2013, the case of State of North Dakota versus Raymond C. Halverson officially went to trial. Local media covered it extensively, calling it one of the most successful cold case reinvestigations in state history. In the Fargo office, Holt watched the TV screen showing Halverson being escorted into the courtroom, gray prison jumpsuit, face calm, as if he were just attending a stranger's trial. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the courthouse square, and in the quiet room, Holt knew justice had enough evidence to take the witness stand. This time, it wasn't Clara Jensen speaking, but science, time, and persistence, all raising their voices for her. The trial of State of North Dakota versus Raymond C. Halverson opened in the winter of 2013, at the Ramsey County Courthouse in Devil's Lake. The biting February cold blanketed the square in front of the court in white, gusts cutting into skin, but inside the courtroom, the air heated with the community's anticipation. A case dormant for over 3 decades now awakened. The public gallery was packed with reporters, cameras from 3 local TV stations positioned right behind the barrier. Clara Jensen, a name once confined to old files, was now read aloud line by line under the courthouse dome. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Breivik, a young but famously sharp prosecutor, stepped to the podium with a thick file, opening with a decisive statement, "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just a murder, but a journey of justice stolen for 32 years and now reclaimed." On the evening of September 25, 1980, reporter Clara Jensen vanished from her small home by Devil's Lake. What remained then was a silent room, a disconnected phone, and a cold coffee cup on the table. Today we will show every step, from the smallest trace to the final evidence, proving that Raymond C. Halverson killed her. He opened the file, projecting a large screen timeline: 1980, disappearance; 1982, case moved to cold case; 2011 file, reopened by Detective Holt; 2012 DNA match. Each milestone appeared with evidence photos, nylon fibers, industrial oil traces, the victim's shirt, the wedding ring, and a 3D crime scene reconstruction. Each piece was a slice of the past, stitched together into a complete picture of the crime. The first witness was Detective Maren Holt. She detailed the case reopening, from discovering the sealed evidence box to covert surveillance, and collecting Halverson's DNA at the gas station. In a calm but firm voice, Holt explained the legal process at each step. All samples were collected and verified under BCI standards. The evidence chain of custody has been uninterrupted from 1980 to now. When Breivik asked, "And the DNA comparison results?" she replied, "Perfect match." No doubt. Next was forensic expert Emily Tran, who handled the genetic genealogy analysis. She explained in detail how DNA from the scene was used to trace biological relatives, clarifying that the process only used legally public data. No privacy invasion, no unauthorized interference, she told the court. "We simply followed the genetic map to the name justice had forgotten." The defense tried to counter. They argued the DNA evidence could have been cross-contaminated during storage, that the oil and nylon fibers were insufficient to prove premeditated murder. They called an independent expert to question the reliability of the 3D scene reconstruction, claiming the model is just technical assumption, unable to accurately recreate the perpetrator's mindset. However, each rebuttal was swiftly dismissed by Prosecutor Breivik with facts. He projected images from the reconstruction, blood spatter position, impact angle, and Halverson's statements, all perfectly matching the single scenario, a deliberate attack. He says it was an accident, Breivik said in his morning closing, but he disconnected the phone, turned off the porch light, and brought binding rope. That's not an accident, that's preparation. That afternoon, the prosecution called the final witness, the forensic technician presenting the wedding ring analysis results. When he said the words latent fingerprint confirmed, the courtroom fell silent. On the screen, the fingerprint enlarged, matching 100% with Halverson's right index finger. Undeniable evidence. The defense attorney, in a last effort, moved to exclude the fingerprint results due to excessive storage time. But when Breivik presented the report from the National Forensic Institute, proving sample integrity and sealing process, the judge simply shook his head. Evidence valid. Proceed. The trial lasted 8 days. The press called it a reconstruction of criminal history. Outside, Devil's Lake residents brought flowers to place before an old photo of Clara, in front of the courthouse, as if to witness the justice they once doubted now returned. On deliberation day, the 12 jury members were led into the sealed room. Holt sat back in the witness area, looking through the high window where winter light fell on the cold floor. For 32 years, every trace, every mistake, every mystery had been linked by an unbreakable logical chain. Inside the deliberation room, silence stretched on. 2 hours passed, then 3, then 6. Finally, when the door opened and the foreman entered, the courtroom held its breath. ADA Breivik stood, gripping his file tightly. The Jensen case's journey, spanning more than half a lifetime, had reached its end, awaiting only one answer from the 12 people bearing the weight of justice. On the morning of February 4, 2013, the Ramsey County courtroom was thick with silence. Hundreds of people packed the gallery seats, many who had followed the Jensen case for years, now returning just to hear the 2 words that would settle more than 30 years of missed justice. Halverson was led in, wearing a light gray prison jumpsuit, his hair white as snow, his face deeply etched with wrinkles, but his eyes still cold and calm. Detective Holt sat in the back row, between Prosecutor Daniel Breivik and Clara Jensen's mother, a woman in her 70s, her hands clutching an old handkerchief, trembling slightly in her lap. When the judge took the bench, all whispers immediately ceased. The judge looked over at the jury box, his voice even and solemn. Have you reached a verdict? The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood up, holding a folded sheet of paper. Each word was read slowly and clearly. We, the jury of the state of North Dakota, having considered all the evidence, testimony, and arguments from both sides, find the defendant Raymond Charles Halverson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of victim Clara Jensen. In that moment, the room seemed to erupt in sighs of relief, with a few quiet sobs echoing. Clara's mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down without a word. Holt sat silently, her eyes red. Halverson remained seated, showing no emotion, only a slight frown as if hearing a familiar news report. The judge continued with the sentencing, considering the severity of the act, the premeditation, and the length of time evading the law. The court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. The defendant will serve his sentence at the North Dakota State Penitentiary, in Bismarck. He paused for a beat, his voice lowering. 32 years, a young life stolen, and this state's justice has waited too long. Today the court closes the case, but opens the peace that the community, and especially the Jensen family, deserves. As the police escorted Halverson out of the courtroom, he turned his head, glanced at Holt, and gave a faint smile. Are you satisfied now? Holt didn't respond, just watched him until the steel door closed. In that moment, she didn't feel victory, only the silence of a long chapter ending. Local media published the news that afternoon, justice for Clara Jensen, 32 years later. The article in the Grand Forks Herald quoted Prosecutor Breivik, "This case proves that time cannot hide the truth. Technology may change, witnesses may disappear, but evidence will always speak." A week later, Holt returned to Devil's Lake for Clara Jensen's memorial at the lake shore, where she had vanished in 1980. The late winter sky was gray and hazy, the lake frozen over, wind blowing through the bare trees. Clara's mother placed a bouquet of white daisies beside the small marker engraved with her daughter's name. She turned to Holt, took her hand, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing my daughter home." Holt just nodded, saying nothing. On the drive back to Fargo, Holt turned on the radio. The afternoon news recapped the case, mentioning the wedding ring, the nylon rope, the matching DNA, the pieces she had pieced together from the ashes of time. She turned off the radio, looked out the car window where snow was falling heavily, and thought to herself, "Justice never dies, it only sleeps in silence, waiting for someone patient enough to wake it." At the end of the case summary report, Holt wrote a short line, like a final farewell, "Case #8104, closed. Justice served. Clara Jensen, 1953, 1980. 32 years of waiting, and finally, justice had taken shape. And in the freezing North Dakota winter, an old case closed, leaving a peaceful silence, instead of the howling winds by Devil's Lake on that night, long ago. After the historic trial ended, it seemed the Clara Jensen case was closed forever, but for the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation (BCI), justice never stops at a verdict. In March 2013, as Halverson's sentence was just beginning at Bismarck Prison, the BCI Forensics Lab started reviewing all files of missing persons and unsolved murders in the Devil's Lake, Grand Forks area, from 1978 to 1985. The goal was to find how many other Clara Jensens had vanished without ever getting their names back. The new investigation team, led by Detective Maren Holt, along with the forensic experts from the Jensen case, began comparing Halverson's DNA data to dozens of old samples stored in the state's cold storage. Part of this work stemmed from the success of the case itself. After justice for Clara was served, the North Dakota state prosecutor allocated additional funding to BCI to reopen cold cases with similar elements. In mid-May, the Fargo lab announced the first results. Halverson's DNA partially matched two unsolved cases: the disappearance of Kelly Jo Strickland, a University of Minot student in 1979, and the case of Lena MacArthur, a grocery store clerk in Lakota, who vanished in 1981. Both were recorded as missing under suspicious circumstances, but no perpetrator had ever been identified. Evidence from the scenes at the time, a few hairs, oil stains on a jacket, and a broken piece of nylon rope, had been inadequately preserved, making testing impossible back then. When the partial match results came in, Holt just went still. Though she had suspected Halverson hadn't stopped at one victim, seeing the evidence on paper still sent a chill through her. The genetic analyses showed that the DNA structures from the two cases could share a common genetic line, not enough for absolute confirmation, but strong enough to reopen all the files. The question now was no longer, who killed Clara Jensen, but how many more secrets is Halverson hiding under the cold ice of Devil's Lake? BCI held a press conference in early June. Holt stood beside the bureau director and prosecutor Rennick. In front of the reporters, Rennick declared, "The Jensen result doesn't just bring justice to one person, but to those who have never been named. We are reopening at least 5 files, showing signs of matching Halverson's modus operandi." When asked if he could be a serial killer, Holt didn't confirm, only saying, "We don't know everything he's done yet, but I believe the answers are still out there, in the files, in the ground, or in his own blood." The ripple effect of the Jensen case led the North Dakota state legislature to quickly pass a new bill in September 2013, the Jensen Initiative, the state's first comprehensive DNA storage and analysis program, aimed at preserving and retesting every biological sample related to unsolved cases before 1995. The law required all evidence, no matter how old or inconclusive, to be stored permanently in standard cold storage, preventing repeats of the mistakes in the Jensen case. Holt was invited as a technical advisor for the program. At the bill signing ceremony in Bismarck, she stood quietly in the back row, looking at the new brass plaque, in memory of Clara Jensen, whose story proved that justice has no expiration date. Those words made her feel both proud and choked up. Clara, the young reporter who vanished into the cold Devil's Lake night, had now become a symbol for a statewide judicial reform. At Bismarck Prison, Halverson refused all interviews. He lived in isolation, accepting no mail, attending no questioning sessions related to the other cases. However, investigators continued collecting genetic data from his personal items to expand comparisons with unsolved cases. Preliminary results suggested he could be linked to at least 3 locations around Devil's Lake, a pattern of behavior spanning over 10 years that no one had ever noticed. At the end of 2014, the Grand Forks Herald published an editorial, "The Jensen Case Changed North Dakota Forever." The piece ended with, "From a single tragedy, we have built a system that no longer lets justice sleep in cold files." As for Detective Holt, on a late evening in the BCI office, she stood looking out the snow-covered window. Under the yellow light, she saw her reflection, tired but at peace. On the desk, an old photo of Clara Jensen lay next to a new file labeled, "Strickland, 1979, reopened." She whispered, like a promise, "We're still going, Clara. As long as the truth is under this ice, I won't stop." In the spring of 2014, the snow at Devil's Lake melted earlier than usual. The surface of Stump Lake appeared under a pale gray sky, so still that even the small ripples sounded like whispers. Detective Maren Holt stood alone by the water's edge, where the area had been cordoned off 34 years earlier, to search for Clara Jensen's body. No more barriers, no more sealed tape, just the silent lake and a gentle breeze carrying the smell of oil from the old boat dock. She knew this was her last time returning. 3 days later, Holt sat in the BCI office in Fargo, finalizing the last report for case #8104, Jensen, Clara. On the screen, the words appeared steadily and neatly, "Status, solved." The file, thousands of pages thick, including the 1980 investigation reports, 2013 court transcripts, and Jensen Initiative technical documents, was checked one final time before closing. As she signed the last page, Holt felt her hand tremble slightly, not from fatigue, but from realizing the case was officially over. No more pending, no more under review, just one word she had waited her entire career to type: solved. She carefully placed the file in a metal storage box, labeled and sealed it. The box label read in small letters, "Case #8104, Jensen, Clara, Devil's Lake, North Dakota, 1980, solved, 2013. Filed by Det. Maren Holt, BCI Cold Case Unit, April 2014. Before closing the lid, Holt paused for a moment, slipping in a printed photo of Stump Lake, a picture taken with her phone, showing only the water and misty sky. No people. That was how she wanted to end the story, not with blood, courts or sentences, but with the place where it all began, where time and technology finally met to bring the truth back. That afternoon, BCI held a small meeting. The agency director read words of thanks, referring to the Jensen success as a milestone, opening a new era for forensic investigation in North Dakota. During the meeting, Holt said little. She just smiled when she saw on the wall the photo of Clara Jensen, the young woman with a gentle smile and hopeful eyes. Below the photo was a shiny metal inscription, "Justice may sleep, but it never dies. After the ceremony, Holt drove back to Devil's Lake one more time. The road around the lake was empty, the fields beside it, still patchy with melting ice. She stopped at the overlook for Stump Lake, exactly where the search team had found Clara's jacket. Holding a small notebook, Holt wrote a few short lines. April 2014, case closed. Clara Jensen, 27 years old, forgotten for 32 years, but remembered forever as a symbol of tireless justice. Then she tore out the page, folded it, and placed it under a small stone right by the water's edge. The wind blew gently, carrying tiny water droplets onto the road, reflecting the late-day sunlight. Holt looked out over the lake, where golden light was slowly spreading, blending with the mist. In that moment, she felt as if someone was standing beside her, not Halverson, not a colleague, but Clara herself, with the same smile from the old photo. Back in the car, Holt turned on the radio and heard a short news update. The Jensen Initiative has officially added 3 more cold cases to the re-investigation list thanks to advanced DNA technology. The announcer's voice was steady, but in Holt's heart rose a quiet sense of continuation. Clara Jensen was not just a victim, she had become the reason an entire system no longer forgot those who disappeared in silence. As the car crossed the bridge over Devil's Lake, Holt glanced in the rearview mirror, the lake behind shimmering in the evening light, tranquil to the point of surreal. She whispered, as if to herself, "It's over, Clara." And then in the last glow of the sunset, Devil's Lake returned to its inherent stillness, where water, time, and justice merged, closing a story, buried for over 30 years, leaving only one certainty: the truth, no matter how long it's submerged, eventually rises to the surface. The story of Clara Jensen and the 32-year journey to find justice deeply reflects the core values of modern American society: faith in science, the power of perseverance, and the responsibility to protect the truth. In a country where technology is constantly advancing, the Jensen case shows that justice comes not only from the law, but from people's ability to look back at the past with the tools of the present. Detective Maren Holt is not just the image of a dedicated investigator, but a symbol of the new generation, those who believe that data, DNA, and technology are not emotionless, but can become the voice for those who have been silenced. From the wedding ring that was found, the industrial oil stain on the jacket, to the DNA match after 3 decades, each small detail reminds us that the truth never disappears. It only waits to be discovered. In today's life, when people are easily swept up in the speed of information and forget old stories, the Jensen case is a reminder that the value of justice lies not in time, but in the will to never give up. It also evokes personal responsibility in every American: respect the truth, no matter how small, and believe that today's efforts can redeem something thought lost forever. On a deeper level, the Jensen Initiative, born from that very tragedy, is proof that pain, when faced directly and handled with intelligence, can become the foundation for societal change. And in an America still struggling with imperfect justice, Clara Jensen's story reminds us, sometimes, the most important thing is not starting early, but never stopping. Thank you for following the story of Clara Jensen's journey for justice, where time, science, and determination together brought the truth back to light. Please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring other cold cases with us, where every small clue can change an entire fate.